Hello, you are on the Ruslan Belov channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine as of July 27, 2025. A great number of events have occurred today, so let's get started. A small request: if you are interested in our analysis, please support the channel with a subscription, a like, and write in the comments where you are watching us from and what you think about what is described. And we are starting. We will begin with the Zaporizhzhia sector of the front, where the armed forces of the Russian Federation are advancing further north towards the settlement of Stepnohirsk. And as you can see, today we have adjustments on the map. They are very interesting. Well, let's take it in order. We'll start with the fact that today some Russian experts noted the advancement of Russian units in this area, almost completely coloring the settlement of Plavny in the color of the Russian army's control, as well as slightly touching the southern part of the settlement with a small coloring. Based on this report, we did not adjust anything, but we began to closely monitor this direction in anticipation of any geolocations that could confirm this information. And closer to noon, the first frames of objective control appeared. At least, that's what pro-Ukrainian sources say. Here we can observe the work of Ukrainian operators of FPV drones, and in these frames we can see a drone strike on a basement. The sources report, more precisely, Ukrainian sources report that it was in this basement that the Russian army was trying to accumulate forces. It is difficult to say what exactly was accumulating there, because during this video we were never able to see a single Russian soldier. Of course, there is an extremely high probability that units of sabotage and reconnaissance groups entered the territory of the 3rd micro-district of Stepnohirsk and possibly began to gain a foothold, accumulating in anticipation of the main army. It is difficult to assume, but there was an attempt at a counterattack by the armed forces of Ukraine. A little later, in addition to these materials, information appeared that the Ukrainian side managed to counterattack and completely restore control over the 3rd micro-district. That is, we are now waiting for additional geolocations, additional information. But in any case, we see that here, the front line is also not withstanding the pressure of the Russian army. This is how the map in this area looked just yesterday, at the end of July 26, 2025. Today, I repeat, information has appeared about the Russian army's consolidation in the 3rd micro-district of the settlement of Stepnohirsk. In the near future, we should expect a fairly high intensity of hostilities here, because this micro-district is very important. Once again, look at these frames. Here it is small, literally, perhaps a dozen buildings. In general, it resembles Vuhledar to some extent, only 4 or 5 times smaller. But in any case, this is a very important micro-district. There are many high-rise buildings, a lot of concrete, a lot of roofs, a lot of important positions where the Russian army can really accumulate before the supposed push further north towards the central and main part of Stepnohirsk. Next, we move to the South Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk directions, where hostilities continue. Let me remind you that just yesterday, the Vostok group of forces published 2 video materials in one day dedicated to the hostilities on the territory of the settlement of Malievka, as well as on the territory of the settlement of Zelensky High. These are the frames of objective control that flew all over the internet yesterday. Here, how the hostilities were conducted, and as usual, by tradition in such video materials, in its last part, a large number of frames are published showing Russian units, soldiers raising flags in various parts of the settlement. Yesterday, both settlements were colored. Today, information is coming in that the Russian army is gradually beginning to move further. And at the moment, the Russian army is concentrated in the area of the settlements of Oleksandrograd, as well as Yanvarske. One of the settlements is still on the territory of the Donetsk region. The second settlement is already on the territory of the Dnipropetrovsk region. That is, this is already, possibly potentially, the 3rd settlement in the Dnipropetrovsk region that may come under the control of the Russian army. One thing is clear and visible, based on geolocation, that most likely the Russian army will advance further to the west. And here the main problem, or rather the main point, the key point of the entire Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia directions, is the Vovcha River. This is the river that comes from the side of the settlement called Novokatske, Zelensky High, which just yesterday came under the control of the Russian army based on the frames of objective control. Here is this Vovcha River. Here it calmly gains its strength, moves further west, possibly southwest, bypassing such settlements as Velika Mikhailivka, Pokrovsk, and goes further and further. And so we see that now the Russian army is gradually beginning to advance along this river, without crossing the river. Let me remind you that back in June, the Russian army destroyed the bridge in the area of Andriivka-Klevtsovo, and the Russian army also destroyed the bridges in the area of Ivanivka. And today, frames of objective control are coming in, on which we can observe how Russian aviation is destroying all the bridges in the area of the settlement of Velika Mikhailivka. And the essence and task of such strikes are clear. Attempts are being made to reduce the logistical capabilities of the armed forces of Ukraine, as well as to reduce the capabilities of the armed forces of Ukraine to transfer Ukrainian units, so to speak, from the north, from the Ukrainian side, from the Ukrainian bank of the Vovcha River, to the southern part, to let's say the zone of responsibility and the zone of offensive of Russian units. In these frames, we can observe how the bridges and crossings were destroyed in the area of the settlement of Velika Mikhailivka, which at the moment acts as the main hub for the accumulation of Ukrainian units for organizing possible counterattacks, as well as strikes on the positions of the Russian army, which are now trying to advance from the side of Shevchenko, Malievka, Voskresenka, Zelenopilia to the west. And apparently, as the Russian army advances along the Vovcha River from east to west, the Russian army will destroy bridges until the Russian units reach the side of Uspenivka, towards the settlements of Vishnev, Yehorivka, and already from these positions along the Vovcha River, the Russian army, apparently, will begin to turn south with the aim of striking the settlement of Huliai Pol, directly from the north and northeast. The impression is definitely being formed that the main task of the Vostok group of forces in the next stage of the special military operation will be and is the settlement of Huliai Pole, for which active hostilities will now be waged. If we talk about the Dnipropetrovsk direction of the settlement of Novopavlivka, then the map here is not yet undergoing any changes. Active but positional battles are underway. Gradually, the Russian army is trying to cut off a small salient north of Oleksiivka, south of Horokov, a small salient still on the territory of the Donetsk region, which the Russian army is now trying to clear, gradually advancing through the forest belts, but without high intensity of hostilities. Next, we move to the territory of Pokrovsk and the Pokrovsk agglomeration. A lot of interesting news is coming from here today, but all of it is, so to speak, of a positional nature. That is, they do not correct the map, but in general they bring some clarity to what is now happening on the territory of this agglomeration. Let's start with the fact that today these frames are being published, and in these frames we can observe the remains, most likely of the South Pokrovsk citadel. Precisely that outpost, or that citadel, on which the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine in the southern part of the settlement now relies, and apparently on the territory of the entire agglomeration. We see that, despite the fact that the Russian army has made great efforts in previous months to destroy and wipe this, let's say, citadel from the face of the earth, we see that it still retains its potential, and it is precisely for it that Ukrainian units are now clinging in order to prevent a breakthrough of the defense in the entire agglomeration. But despite the fact that the Ukrainian side is holding on, Russian units, in turn, are gradually advancing. At least this is reported by some neutral cartographers. In general, very reliable sources report that between July 26th and 27th, 2025, the following colorings occurred. That is, this is already confident control, but so far without geolocation. But I would like to remind you that some cartographers report that Russian saboteurs can move freely up to these borders, another grey zone that we have put on the map for clarity. That is, we see that saboteurs are gradually moving ahead of everyone. Assaults are gradually advancing with the saboteurs, and behind them are the troops to consolidate. And of course, these frames are also very important. They generally bring some clarity to what is now happening on the territory of the Pokrovsk agglomeration, and what is happening here is what is called by one simple word, hell. Pokrovsk is simply being wiped off the face of the earth. Hostilities are being conducted in different parts, areas. There is constant work on the part of the armed forces of Ukraine to find and eliminate Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups. Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups are constantly seeping into the territory of the city, blocking and paralyzing the work of the armed forces of Ukraine units in the area. Sometimes the armed forces of Ukraine suffer losses in those directions, in those quarters, in those micro-districts where it was not expected. And in general, this is described not only by the simple word hell, but also chaos and panic, mainly in relation to Ukrainian units. But despite all these statements, all these pictures, we see that there have been practically no adjustments over the past day. But this perhaps is not even due to the fact that the Russian army is not advancing. Perhaps the Russian army has advanced so deeply that it is too early to show any adjustments, and everyone is already waiting for more serious results directly on consolidation on the ground. On the northeastern envelopment, information is coming in that the Russian army is now, at the moment, trying to storm the Komsomolskyi spoil tip. It was here that the first units already entered with the aim of expanding the zone of control, and also, possibly, reaching the treatment facilities to the south. In general, hostilities are now unfolding here. The Russian army wants to obtain some parity in relation to the Komsomolska mine, which is now, on which the defense in the eastern envelopment of the Pokrovsk agglomeration is now based. And therefore, with the clearing of the Komsomolsky spoil tip directly, it is possible that the Russian army will be able to level the situation in relation to this strongpoint. And possibly it will become easier for Russian units to advance precisely in the east. But the movement continues to the northeast. Information is coming in that the Russian army has managed to break into the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine between Mayak-Zakidny and reach the Novoshakov road. It was such a maneuver that was carried out by Russian units over the past few days. And now information is also coming in that after a successful breakthrough, the Russian army is trying to advance towards the settlement of Shakov, already from the west. That is, all the defensive lines, all the lines of defense of the armed forces of Ukraine on the territory of the settlement of Shakov and Volodymyrivka are organized in such a way as to meet and repel Russian attacks from the south, southeast, possibly from the east. And the Russian army solved this problem by breaking through the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine in the area of Mayak-Novoshakov, and now is actually advancing on the backs of the Ukrainian units, which apparently did not expect and do not expect such a blow. Perhaps in the near future, some adjustments will appear in this area as well. There are also frames of objective control confirming the advance of the Russian army towards the same Volodymyrivka and Shakov, again from the southeast. Russian units have come almost right up to the anti-tank ditch, which is located in this direction. In general, we see that perhaps the intensity of hostilities in the northeastern envelopment of the Pokrovsk agglomeration has decreased. We are talking about such settlements as Rodinska, again Suketska, Krasny Lyman, but at the same time, the Russian army is not slowing down the pace of the offensive towards Volodymyrivka, Shakov and Sofiivka. That is, it is clear that, regardless of whether it will be possible to gain a foothold in the northeast of the agglomeration, the Russian army clearly and distinctly understands that the bridgehead needs to be expanded. The bridgehead needs to be expanded and strengthened, and it is desirable to create a certain buffer, a distance between the next line of defense on the part of the armed forces of Ukraine, so that if the Ukrainian side decides to counterattack, there will always be several kilometers of passage through the fields, which can give the Russian army a lot of time, unlimited time, to again destroy all this equipment on the approaches to the main positions and main lines of defense. Next, we are moving towards the Cleban-Byk pocket. Today, some pro-Russian but very reliable sources reported that the Russian army broke through the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine northeast of Cleban-Byk and approached the reservoir directly from the east. For now, this information is published exclusively by individual telegram channels, but very reliable ones. And according to them, Russian units are now located here, trying to gain a foothold. However, the Ukrainian side clearly and distinctly understands that if the Russian army manages to gain a foothold on the territory of these strongholds, then in fact the Ukrainian units, as it is written in the telegram post, will be sealed, more precisely, sealed south of Cleban-Byk. That is, this is effectively a cauldron. Let me remind you, yesterday information was received, these days, more precisely, about the complete clearing of Yablunivka and Oleksandro Kalinove, and that it is also impossible to pass here. Today, information is received about the capture of these strongholds, respectively, It is also impossible to pass here. Perhaps there is, let's say, some chance of escaping from the territory of the Cleban-Byk pocket by, so to speak, swimming across the reservoir itself. Well, most likely Ukrainian units are using such options, but if we talk about land routes for retreat, they are already absent. It is also reported that the Ukrainian side has made several attempts to counterattack towards Cleban-Byk over the past day in order to unblock the Ukrainian units. However, it is also reported that at the moment, all attacks, without exception, have been repelled by the Russian army. Russian units continue to consolidate and improve their positions in this area as well. Next, we are moving to the Siversk direction, where something is brewing. Let me remind you that just yesterday, quite powerful colorings were made along the Siversky Donetsk River. Large sections of the forest were colored based on frames of objective control published by pro-Russian sources. And here, one gets the impression that the front line has collapsed in general, and this front line, which had not actually moved since the end of 2022, began to move, to stir with a fairly high pace, and at the moment, a large number of frames of objective control are being published, showing how the Russian army is working with aviation and artillery on Zaporizhzhia itself, on Siversk itself. We see that the intensity of hostilities here is only increasing. So far, no clear movement on the ground is noted, but this is apparently only a matter of time. There is a high probability that in the near future, the Russian army will go on the offensive in this area. Perhaps hostilities for Siversk itself will begin. But we have been, so to speak, demonstrating and discussing such a probability, starting perhaps from April 2025. Such intensity of hostilities and such tension may even persist until the summer of 2026. That is, we assume, and then we will observe how the situation will develop. In the northern sector of the front, the Russian army is gradually advancing around Kupiansk, however, as you can see, without any frames of objective control. If we talk about the northern directions in general, then any news from the Sumy sector of the front has stopped coming in at all. Although it is reported that the Ukrainian side, after clearing the settlement of Kondrativka, is now trying to regroup in order to counterattack towards the settlement of Oleksivka. And perhaps, in the near future, we will begin to receive some frames of objective control and news from this direction. And if we talk about adjustments in favor of the Russian army, they are coming directly from the Vovchansk sector. A small section of forest, east of the Vovchansk village of Tika, has also come under the control of the Russian army. And that's all, dear friends. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel, give your likes, and all the best to you.